This is Theology Bits with Pastor Ben, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. This is our continued series, Continuity and Change in the Old Testament, and believe it or not, video 12 on the division and fall. Now this is we're covering a huge amount of time and content in this one video, but I want to do that because remember the point is the difference in theology and how things changed over time. And to review, last time we talked about the development of the temple, the king, and the place. That is, the temple built on Mount Zion, connected to the king as the capital, with Jerusalem being the capital, and the king and temple being one thing. Remember, there was a covenant that there would be a king that would last forever from the line of David, and so there became this idea that Zion would last forever, that capital, and the temple being built there is, and how is that going to be guaranteed? Because God's there with the temple. Well, that's where we kind of left, that the religious and the political have become completely united, and that they were, more than anything else, a nation. And the religiosity they had were very national religiosities. And so much of it all came through the capital, meaning Zion or the temple or the king, all one thing. So this is what we had last time. Now, if you recall from about 3 videos ago when they established the kingship, one of the goals they had was that these 12 disparate tribes would become one nation. That was the goal of having a king. It was what was different from the judges. Well, that works under 3 kings: Saul, David, Solomon. As soon as Solomon dies, something happens. The new king, Solomon's son, is by the name of Rehoboam. And there's a whole conversation and story related to this where Rehoboam essentially promises he's going to be much harder on the people than Solomon was. And it creates a division. 10 of those 12 tribes rebel. And they form another nation called Israel. And this is unfortunately a little confusing. They also can be called Ephraim. Sometimes they'll simply be called the Northern Kingdom because it just gets a little confusing. When the 2 remaining is going to be a nation called Judah, which was the name of one of the tribes. And this nation is the one that has Jerusalem in it. And so you have this radical division. And the leadership for this one is of a figure by the name of Jeroboam, whereas Rehoboam is the king of this division. But really, from here on out, they never really reconcile, except for maybe one little moment in around 620 BC under King Josiah. But they never reconcile. They become 2 nations. So what's happened? The very goal of the kingship, this whole thing about kings, breaks after only 3 kings. Now there's 2 nations that are going to act differently. And so it no longer becomes that they're going to be a nation and that's going to express their religiosity, because obviously they're not a nation. They're 2 nations. And when this happens, not only are they 2 nations, but there's this idea they could be who knows how many nations. You know, what's going to be next? Apparently, the national body is not going to be what unites them any longer. Instead, what becomes key is, where is your worship center? Now, this is what, for Judah, which is where most of our writings come from, there's a reason they do this. The temple's there. It's the same worship center that Solomon had and that David had. Even though David, it wasn't the temple, it was the tabernacle, but it was the same place. Well, Jeroboam, understandably, isn't going to have his independent nation have their worship center in a foreign country's capital. And so he sets up 2 worship centers, one at Dan, one at Bethel. By the way, the one at Dan has been discovered, and you can see the archaeological remains. You can visit it. The Bethel is lost. We don't know where that is. But he sets up these 2. Now, this develops a theology. Now you have rival, for lack of a better terms, temples. And these rival temples are rival ways of worshiping God. And most of our theology comes from Judah, and they're going to be very clear. The temple at Jerusalem is the only one you should worship at, ever. Very rare in the ancient world, by the way. Usually there were many temples to a god. Here they just have the one, which happens to be their capital. Here in the north, they don't have that. But for the Deuteronomistic historian who is looking at this, there might be, that's the way they're thinking about religiosity, but there is only one litmus test to whether or not you're following Torah, or whether or not you are righteous before God, which is, are you following Torah? Are you following that law that Moses received, which, by the way, didn't require a capital, didn't require a land, didn't require any of these things? Are you following it or not? Well, what happened? This becomes a narrative about kings. Some kings are good, some kings are bad. Remember the theology that we had with the king. The problem with Torah and king is, even if the people in the nation want to follow Torah, even if they want to be righteous before God, if the king does not, then they're out of luck. They have to do what the king wants to do. So it becomes about the kings. Are they faithful to Torah or not? And that's what measures whether they're good or bad, and it measures whether they will have success or failure. And so what we're going to see is that as this goes along, this trajectory, it is a trajectory of Torah abandonment. Leading to eventual failure and exile, which is why it's the division and fall. But it's gonna track differently. So we have the northern kingdom. Torah observation is going to decline more quickly, and in 729 BC, the superpower called Assyria conquers them, and there's a whole narrative about this that I don't want to get into right now, maybe for another video, another time, in another series. And the nation falls. And it never comes back. We lose this community of these 10 tribes. Here in Judah, it lasts longer, but the trajectory goes the same way. Torah ceases to be followed, and in 586 BC, the new superpower by the name of Babylon comes, conquers the nations, takes the people out of it, and puts them in a foreign land. It takes them to Babylon in what we call exile. Now, there's going to be a lot of things going on with that, but here we see this is the theology of the Deuteronomistic historian. The kings were good or bad, and eventually it led to the failure that we have, that they'd always described. If you're following Torah, you'll have political success, political failure. Well, what's the ultimate political failure? You just lost the nation. But notice what this focus is on as they're living there, how they determine their religiosity. Where's your worship center? Well, this is totally different. And of course, what they're depending on is that out of Zion should come Sinai. And meaning out of the temple should come Torah observation. And so then it was an issue in the south. Are you listening to it? In the north, well, then they're just set up to fail. Because if it's out of Zion becomes Sinai, well, where's Sinai here? Where's Torah here? Now, when Moses received it, there was no reason why it had to be in a place, but it just became that way. Then there's going to be a lot going on. This is the period where you're going to have some of our famous prophets that we're not going to have time to talk about, such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, a whole community of different figures. Amos, Hosea, in this time period. So a huge amount of literature, all with different theologies. But what I want to show is how different this is than what we thought was before. And so now we're going to move forward next time, once they're in this exile, and see how radically different theology will change. That'll be the focus of our next several videos. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.